Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Serial Killer Saturdays on Cowboy Criminology. I'm Derek Judd, the Cowboy Criminologist. So, we've been going over Gerard John Schaefer, and we've been talking about him in some great detail. And when we left off last week, we talked about his kidnapping of Trotter and Wells. And what makes Schaefer so what makes the Schaefer case just so extraordinary is that he had actually been killing since 68 or 69. Uh, and here we are in 1972. Excuse me. In 1972, uh, I was trying to get some more information for y'all to see if I was leaving anything out about Gerard John Schaefer that might be relevant or of interest. And everything I found about him seemed to be very convoluted, not convoluted in a bad way, uh, but the way that most people are familiar with Gerard John Schaefer, it has a very Quentin Tarantino esque uh, way about the case. We start with the middle of his life, we go back to the beginning, and now we're fast forwarding to the end. And at least two victims have been tied to him since 2015, which is very interesting. That speaks a lot about uh, the power of DNA and forensic genealogy. And I'll talk a little bit more about forensic genealogy here in just a little bit. But uh, very, very interesting because a lot of Gerard John Schaefer's victims, um, it's been really difficult to figure out who is actually a victim of Gerard John Schaefer, who is a suspected victim of Gerard John Schaefer, and who who has no ties to Schaefer whatsoever. Um, it's a little difficult because Schaefer is suspected in over 30 different homicides. Uh, Obviously, to be a serial killer by FBI definition, you just need to kill two or more people using the same modus operandi and signature with a defined cooling off period. Okay, so there's not really anything. It's not exactly difficult to be labeled a serial killer. One thing I found was hilarious is he's always called the killer cop, um, or the hangman, or the butcher, or one thing or another. But everybody focuses um, on his career as a law enforcement officer. Well, you have to understand his career as a law enforcement officer was about 7 months, and to put it in perspective for you, um, most law enforcement agencies in the United States right now have a 6 month field training program, um, followed by a 6 month probationary program. Now that can be accelerated if an officer has previous experience, or well, usually that's the only thing, or maybe it's a smaller department, or they have a very niche focus on what they investigate. Uh, but everybody focuses on this. It's not like he was a career law enforcement officer, and there was a state trooper. I believe he was a state trooper in California that actually was a serial killer during his law enforcement career, and highly respected. Uh, Very, very interesting case. I think we'll talk about him uh, on a later edition. Uh, but with Schaefer, there were so many things that kind of clouded him, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But like I said, he was suspected in over 30 murders. Okay, um, he's been conclusively tied to, I think, about five. Um, not really. How should I say this? In terms of a lot of other serial killers, your Bundys, your Dahmers, your Richard Ramirez, your Dennis Rader or Gary Ridgway, Robert Hansen. As far as those guys, there's not really anything extraordinary about Schaefer other than for a whopping 7 months, he was a police officer. Okay, now just a little side note, little background. A lot of serial killers um, have tried to get into law enforcement, and they were either drummed out because of their behavior, or they could never pass psychological testing, or or they couldn't adapt. They couldn't fit in. They always wanted to do it their way. It's a profession they've never been in. They don't know anything about it. But like most people with borderline or antisocial personality disorder, regardless of whatever evidence there is to the contrary, they are the smartest person in the room, which is usually the downfall of most serial killers. And Schaefer is no exception. So let me just clarify this real quick. Gerard John Schaefer was not an exceptional serial killer. He was bright. He was highly organized, and so when I say organized, the FBI have three types of serial killers. Okay, you've got your organized, your disorganized, and you've got your mixed. An organized offender usually drives, has planned out the crime. They usually carry burglary tools. They have their burglary tools usually also involve a rape kit, so duct tape, rope, zip ties, knife, gun, and whatever other implements that they use to enhance the pleasure of their crime. Um, they also generally have a primary location for where they meet with their victim, and then a secondary location where they dispose of their victim. Okay, that's not always the case. It's not a hard fast rule, but genuinely, um, people don't go out into the Florida swamplands, fasten themselves to a tree, and then kill themselves in horrific ways. They usually have some help with that, and it's usually done without their consent. So, so Schaefer is organized. A disorganized offender would be the exact opposite. This is somebody who uh, walks or has limited mobility. A lot of their crimes are committed within a very, very short distance of their work or home. Um, they they tend to use more blitz style attacks because they don't have the criminal sophistication of Schaefer or Bundy to be able to approach their victims or their preferred victims. And then you have mixed, and the mixed offender profile can tell you one of two things. Um, it can tell you most of the time. I'll tell you one of three things. The first is that the the unsub decided they were going to commit a specific type of crime, and when a new crime presented itself. Say they broke in with the intention of committing a burglary, then they see a single woman step out of the shower, and oh, hey, she's not expecting anybody to be here. He's not expecting anybody to be here. He grabs a knife from the kitchen, uh, uses a power cord from a lamp, something like that. Now, could that just be a first time offender? It absolutely could. Uh, but if that can also tell you what the primary motivation of the offender is, if it's if you start seeing those happen in a very small area, you're dealing with a disorganized offender. Usually, somebody who doesn't have the criminal sophistication to enter a home and commit a rape or uh, a murder. Usually, they're after quick items, jewelry, cash, things that are easily disposed of. But they also tend to stay close to home and have poor impulse control when they commit their crimes. The second thing it can tell you is, depending on the crime scene, it can tell you you may be dealing with two completely different types of offenders, depending on what evidence is there. But in a crime scene where you have a mixed offender profile, you could be looking at more than one unsub. And the third is um, your classic disorganized uh, profile. And if you have watched my vampire series, you'll know that Richard Trenton Chase, who's known as the Vampire of Sacramento, he fits the disorganized profile down to a T. But usually, this type of offender has a severe mental incapacitation that limits their ability to function on their own. Um, Going back the other direction, the organized serial killer offender has almost reached kind of mythic proportions, especially with Ted Bundy, because he wasn't this wild-eyed, slack-jawed monster just lurking and drooling in the corner. This was upwardly mobile, sophisticated, college-educated. Uh, I guess you'd call him a gentleman of quality. Um, but several law enforcement officials, including John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and Roy Hazelwood, have talked about the problems with Bundy kind of being the poster child for serial killers in America. And part of that problem is he was this he was an outlier. He was everything I said he was, and so much more. He was suave, charismatic. He could easily talk himself out of even some of the most serious situations. But his ability to elude justice, he escaped twice. He could he could change his entire appearance just by changing what he was wearing and how he combed his hair or grew out his facial hair. It was it's funny, if you look at a lot of photos of Bundy side by side, you'd almost swear that they were different people. Okay. Bundy actually figures into this story. I'm not just on a segue about him. Uh, so, but anyway, here's the thing. At this point, where we're at right now, and we're in uh, the late summer, early fall of 1972, and the only thing Schaefer's been charged with so far is being a colossal douchebag for attempting to teach two teenage girls a lesson about hitchhiking. Okay. So he's out on bond right now. Here things get a little things get a little weird here. Okay, so according to research and everything I could find, there are several victims that are attributed to Bundy either because of modus operandi, signature, timeline, um, that are tied to Bundy. Now, later on, we're going to talk about some of the evidence that was found, and we're going to talk again about Sandra London. But I'm just gonna read off a couple of people right now who were suspected of being Bundy victims. The first one is Leonard Joseph Masser. So on August 11th, uh, this is a there's no real connection between Masser and Schaefer, other than where Masser was found. Uh, it indicated somebody who enjoyed torture. Masser's hands had been severed, and he was found in a location fairly close to where uh, Trotter and Wells had been taken to when Schaefer abducted them. Now, little caveat there. We're talking the Florida swamplands. Um, we've talked about the devastating effect that water in general has on hiding evidence. Well, now you take a body and you put it into a swamp where you have all kinds of different predators, insects, soil types, murky water. And so it's really no wonder that bodies get found in swamps, but connecting them to a specific connecting them to a specific individual gets to become a huge challenge. And uh, so Masser is actually tied, his only connection uh, to Schaefer is that when Schaefer was writing to people, simultaneously saying, I didn't do it, and saying, let me tell you how I did it, Masser's murder was referenced. To that end, it is not uncommon for serial killers to bolster their reputation by taking credit for unsolved homicides, especially if they're really ghastly. Yeah, I did that. And they fill in enough details to be credible, but not anything that you could really, uh, nothing you could really pin down as a confession, at least in a court of law. Okay. August 31st, Elizabeth Renee Wilt from Fayetteville, Arkansas. She's traveling to the Republican National Convention in Miami Beach, and she's going to attend uh, she's going to attend this convention, and she's let her stepmother know through a postcard that she intended to return. So this wasn't just somebody who decided, hey, you know what, I'm not going to bother coming back. Now, her body's never been found, but you, what a lot of people don't understand is that DNA is so very new, and evidence collection from law enforcement before about 40 years ago was completely different than it is today. And the same thing with retention on that evidence and one thing or another. So we may never know uh, if Miss Wilt was actually a victim or what, especially without a body. But the timeline fits, and when we get to the evidence that was collected, you're gonna kind of find out how he thinks. Now, September 27th, 1972. Okay. We're about 13 months past the Trotter and Wells kidnapping. And a lot of people would say, well, he's been out on bond this whole time. And I laugh and I say, yeah, it's not like Law and Order where the arrest is made and 2 weeks we go to trial. That's not the way these things happen. Um, Defense attorneys take a master class in learning to ask for continuances uh, in order to prolong a trial. And they do that not with any kind of evil intent, but let's face it, the longer it takes to get to trial, memories fade, evidence degrades, um, the severity, the psychological shock and impact of what the victims went through kind of starts to diminish, and it's very helpful. Now, likewise, prosecutors on the other hand can continue a case for a while as well, although they don't have quite as much leeway as the defense, while they're and that's usually because they're trying to build another case on the same defendant. Um, but anyway, he's out and about. So here's what's going on so far, or so here's what happens. So uh, Schaefer is trying to better himself, of course, because that's what everybody out on bond is doing is trying to become the best version of themselves they can be. So Schaefer is starting to attend adult literacy classes in Fort Lauderdale. Why somebody with a bachelor's degree would need to take those classes, and I don't know what adult education would include at this time. Uh, Maybe it was prepping for a certification for something. New technologies were coming out as far as computer programming. Maybe he was trying to do something like that. We may never know. So, despite that, he ends up meeting Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, 17 and 16 respectively. Now, how they ended up there, was this a creative writing thing? Was this, which actually might make a little more sense why two high school girls were taking classes with adults. It's very interesting. But Schaefer begins referring to himself by that old standby alias of his, Jerry Shepherd. So Jerry Shepherd starts a friendship with Place and Jessup. And what do you know? He's interested in everything that they're interested in. He likes their music. He likes their philosophies on life and religion and the afterlife. And what do you know? This is very common of an organized serial killer like Schaefer. Um, one of the things you might notice with serial killers is, especially with a sexual sadist, they seek out relationships that are not age appropriate. Okay. Let me give you an example. If you knew a couple that were together and that couple was respectively 55 and 70, regardless of age, would you think too much about it? Probably not. What if one of the individuals is 17 and the other one is 26, 27? Do we have a little bit of an issue there? We absolutely do. One of the things that you'll notice about Schaefer is that he continuously, and in fact, a true crime author who wrote about him was actually sued for making this statement. But he said something to the effect of that Schaefer deliberately sought out victims who were weaker both physically and psychologically than he was. And there's a lot of truth to that. You notice there was a 2-year age gap between Schaefer and his first wife, Martha Fogg. Not really no real red flags there. 2 years. I mean, 2 to 5 years. Nobody's really going to say anything about that. Beyond that 5-year mark, you got to start wondering why does this person seeking out any type of relationship with somebody that much younger? Okay. So one afternoon, Jerry Shepherd comes over to Susan Place's house and meets her parents, and they're sitting there and they're talking about going to the beach so that Jerry Shepherd can play guitar for them. Begrudgingly, Lucille Place, Susan's mother, makes the regrettable decision to allow them to go. But Mrs. Place had a good head on her shoulders because she had that intuition that something was off. And this intuition of hers would pay dividends later on in the case. But she made a note that Jerry Shepherd was driving a 1969 Datsun and took down the license plate. Unfortunately, later on that evening, the girls never returned home, and Mrs. Place would go and have to report her daughter and her friend missing. So we go from September to October. He kidnaps 2 other girls, Mary Alice Briscolina and Elisa Lena Farmer, 14 and 13 respectively. Now, these girls were hitchhiking, and the only thing that tied them to Schaefer was evidence that was later found, specifically a piece of jewelry that Briscolina was wearing. December 23rd, Susan Gale Poole. This is interesting. Poole has been the most recent victim tied to Schaefer. She was a Fort Lauderdale teenager reported missing just before Christmas in 1972. She was found in June, bound to a mangrove tree on Singer Island. And there was the body was so poorly preserved that evidence was very, very difficult to find. Now, how did they tie this case to Schaefer? Some of his writings alluded to it. The timeline fit for what he was doing. The modus operandi, attaching her to a mangrove tree. It was very consistent with the psychological torture, which was part of Gerard John Schaefer's signature. Okay. A lot of, I don't know why people are calling it genetic genealogy. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Forensic genealogy. And this is actually a cool story, and this is kind of a segue. But the Golden State rapist was actually the first serial killer brought to justice with forensic genealogy. Let me explain forensic genealogy. So you've got all these different 23andMe ancestry, tell me where I came from kind of things. And some of the disappointment for some celebrities finding out about their family history has been a little funny for me. Traumatic for them, I'm sure, but it's been kind of funny to listen to. But when the Golden State serial killer case or the Golden State rapist case was going on, a DNA sample had been preserved. And a cold case detective, realizing, hey, we've got nothing else to go on, kind of got a wild hair to say, hey, you know what? We've got all these people who are doing these Ancestry, 23andMe, at home DNA tests. I wonder if we can find a familial match. And that's exactly what happened. So a nephew of the Golden State Rapist was actually the closest match that they could find. And when they went and talked to the nephew about, people in his family, one thing or another, he's like, yeah, I think you want to talk to my uncle. And they're like, okay, well, tell me about him. And he's giving them kind of a background. And interestingly enough, he served time as a law enforcement officer. So, unfortunately, yeah, it does happen. Okay, but forensic genealogy has been kind of a tool. Now, a lot of these at-home DNA testing kits are refusing to cooperate with law enforcement um, because they don't want law enforcement just going around comparing DNA swabs and harassing their clients. Which I get to a certain point, and some of these websites will say that they don't comply with law enforcement without a search warrant, and some make no such claim. So, if that's a concern of yours, then maybe don't do those. Um, and if you don't have a feeling about it one way or the other, then by all means, do what you want. Uh, so yeah, kind of cool how forensic genealogy has helped start to close a lot of unsolved missing persons cases. Okay. So that takes us up to December 23rd of 1973. Her body wasn't found until June 1974. Okay. So 1974, how do you ring in the new year? Well, the only way a serial killer knows how. And I want to see if you can start recognizing patterns. So January 11th, Colette Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox are hitchhiking from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, going down to Florida. And they come up missing, and their bodies weren't found until almost 4 years later. Um, they were formally identified by dental records. Uh, Personal effects that belonged to both of the victims were found with Gerard John Schaefer, and he would actually end up writing in very explicit detail about the kidnapping of Colette and Barbara. So the pattern that I want you to recognize, and this is why, if you've been following my channel for any time, I have some serious rants about bail and bond, and who are good candidates for bond, who are good candidates uh, for release on parole and probation. Even if you looked at Gerard John Schaefer from the inset, from the Trotter and Wells case, what police officer doesn't know that they would be so grossly overstepping in teaching this particular lesson? Okay. The answer should be none of them, but I don't know. I've known some officers where I was like, who in the world did your background check? But getting beyond that, you will notice that Gerard John Schaefer has a propensity for taking multiple victims at a time. Uh, when you have somebody who is brave enough to abduct multiple individuals at the same time, so like in the Trotter and Wells case, they were 18 and 19 and 18 respectively. Or I'm sorry, 18 and 17. And so old enough, I mean, pretty much adults, they would have been able to easily recognize him, identify him, testify credibly in court. So when you have somebody who is a law enforcement officer who is accused of committing a crime like this, you really need to start thinking that this is not a first time offense. This is the first time they've been caught. And you need to, if you're going to allow, bail or bond at all, you need to impose some very strict restrictions for this individual. So let's see here. So far we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've got potentially 9 people murdered from August 11th of 1972 to September of 1973. That's a pretty active criminal career for somebody in a very short period of time. Um, some people might argue that, well, maybe he was trying to get caught. Maybe he knew his time was limited, so he was trying to take as many victims, to try and bolster his reputation. And you know what? I think there's probably some truth in that. Really, I think it was his bravado. I think he was so. I'm educated. I'm a police officer. I'm 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 Jerry Schaefer. I'm the world's all around nice guy. Nobody's going to think I had any intention to harm these girls. And at the worst, I'll probably get probation, but you know what? I'll get out from under this because you know what? I can explain this. I've always been able to explain things like this. So I think for him, I just don't think he ever figured that he was ever going to get caught. And so we're going to go ahead and stop here. And in part 5 of this video, I'm going to talk about how criminals tend to. I'm going to kind of walk you through the criminal thought process and kind of show you how Gerard John Schaefer never believed he was going to get caught, or at least never thought he was going to be held accountable. All right. Hey, this is Derek Judd with Cowboy Criminology. Thank you so much for joining me on Serial Killer Saturdays.